This time on the Cameron Journal podcast, we're talking with Sarah Wofford. She is a poet. She is a walking user of a wheelchair, and she's also autistic. So we're going to be talking about disability, access, mental health issues. I'm going to talk about some of my mental health challenges as well. And we're just going to talk and riff for a little bit. It's a really interesting interview. It's a fun conversation. She reads one of her poems too, and her poems are amazing. So strap in. It's the Cameron Journal podcast. Let's go. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are very excited to be joined by Sarah Wofford. She's a poet, among other things. She's a tremendous artist, an incredibly funny person, and we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about ableism, disability, mobility, and how unfriendly our world can be to those who are disabled. So welcome, Sarah, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes, we're very excited to kind of dive into all this sort of thing. So I want to kind of just dive right into the whole situation and kind of give people a sense of who you are and your background. So why don't you catch us up on your life a little bit and explain how you get about in the world and how that affects you a little bit.
Okay. Well, I'm Sarah Wofford. I am from Arkansas, and I am physically disabled. Several years ago, I had a really bad fall at work that really messed up one of my knees, and I've had corrective surgery for it, and it got better for a few weeks, and then it just started getting progressively worse. And so I walk with a cane or a forearm crutch for the most part now. And then if I need to be, if I would need to be on my feet for an extended period of time, like walking around somewhere or whatnot, I have a wheelchair. And so that's kind of my physical disability. And then in my mid-20s, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, which was one of those things. It was like very much, it's one of those things I kind of figured for a while once I read up on the subject a little bit. And then I got a professional diagnosis in my mid-20s.
Excellent. Well, I want to dive right into kind of the zeitgeist going on with disability these days. There's kind of a new very a new kind of thing going on where people are talking about ableism in society and how unfriendly society can be to people who are physically disabled or neurodivergent and all this sort of thing. So and sometimes it can get quite accusatory and a bit conflictual. So maybe walk us through a little bit about ableism and why it's important to build a society that's accommodating for more than just one type of person.
Oh my goodness. Ableism is everywhere. I can't tell you how many, like just driving in town and how many stores it's like, okay, I couldn't get into there. Or if I had my wheelchair, there's no way I could get in there. And even when I'm watching like movies or television, that's where my brain goes, is like, could I exist in this space? And so many times I say, no, I couldn't do that. Like that bus doesn't have a wheelchair ramp. That store has too many stairs. That there's so many things that I see constantly that the aisles are too narrow. I couldn't get my wheelchair down them. Or even if I'm not in my wheelchair and I'm on my crutch, if there's another person, they're going to knock me over. That sort of thing. I just see it. I see it constantly. And it's like little things that people like they expect us to just kind of get over it. Like there'll be like one step into a building and that's it. But there's no ramp and there's no other access. Well, if I'm in my wheelchair, one step it's nearly insurmountable. I'm going to have to get
Might
up.
as well be Mount Everest at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's like little things like that. And then from an autism point of view, just the world was not made for those who are neurodivergent. And there would be no way for you. I understand that there'd be no way for the world to meet everyone's particular needs. But in general, like, the world is super loud and it's super bright. And those are kind of the two main issues that I come up against, is that stores are way too bright. They don't have any natural light in them. And so they're just all these fluorescent lights, and they've got like a bajillion of them. So they're way too bright, and they're all white tiles, and so it reflects, and it's horrific. And they're all way too loud. Like, people in general are too loud. But for some reason, the way stores are built, of course, I'm more sensitive to it, and so I notice it. But places are very loud.
Yeah, and yes, and that's something that I've not really talked about this on the podcast yet, but I guess this is today. At the time of recording, this will come out, but the thing I'm about to talk about will have already happened by the time this comes out. But in a couple weeks, actually 2 weeks, I am going to go in to be evaluated for adult autism.
Mm-hmm.
I found this guy on YouTube who talks about it, and he's from Australia. And I randomly saw his video one night, and for some reason I watched it, and I don't know why, because I've never thought of myself as being in that box. And I watched it, and I was kind of like, oh my God, this person's me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's another one. Like, I mean, I've lived my whole life in a world where I'm like no one else and no one understands me, and quite frankly, I don't understand them, really.
Uh-huh.
And I was kind of like, there's another one. There's one other person who thinks like me. And then that got me reading, and then depression kind of set in, because it's kind of like I started actually reading about it, and I'm just kind of like, oh, this is so obvious. Like, to the most casual observer, this is so obvious.
Yeah.
This is not good. Like, sort of thing. And it's like, oh, I'm wired wrong from manufacture. That's a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm still, and this is going to sound very strange, I'm still struggling with the fact that it's like, there's nothing I can ever do to be normal or like everyone else.
Yes, that's a big,
like
that's a big mental
February,
hurdle.
yes, if February goes the way I think it's going to go, that's going to be the end of any chance I ever have of fitting in with normal society. Like, it's over.
Yeah, I totally understand.
My life. How did you? Well, because this is supposed to be a podcast, I'm supposed to ask you erudite questions.
Uh-huh.
How did you handle that? Even with your physical disability and having that change, how did you, mental health wise, adjust to all of this change in your life?
Well, thankfully, the testing and everything that I had with autism all came about because I had a therapist that I really trusted, and she kind of suggested it. Well, I had brought it up that I was like, I had people in college just straight up ask me, they're like, do you have autism? Which is, don't do that. That's super rude.
Yeah.
Don't do that. That's super rude.
Yes.
But I talked about it with a therapist, and she's like, I think it would be a good idea for you to get tested. And so she ordered the test and everything. And so I already came from it from a pretty sound place And I also I have an anxiety disorder. Shocker. That kind of goes hand in hand with autism a lot. It's various anxiety disorders, and I thought of this as whole like kind of this naming process of I wanted to know the name of what it was I was dealing with.
Oh, I'm in the same boat.
Because
Absolutely.
if I could see it, if I could name what it was, I could at least have a better chance of getting a handle on it. It's not like I could fix it, but I could figure out how to make it work for me. Like before I got my diagnosis of anxiety, I was just a mess. I was a super just a wreck. And I got diagnosed with acute generalized anxiety disorder when I was 15, and I just couldn't go places before that. I was super agoraphobic. And I mean that in like a literal sense, not in the way that some people are like, "Oh, I'm so agoraphobic now because the pandemic." But like, no, I didn't want to leave my house. I was scared to go places,
and there were no lockdowns in place.
Yeah, there were
no
lockdowns in place. No, school was quite horrible for me.
Yeah.
But when they said, okay, you have anxiety, you have panic attacks, when I discovered what it was, I could formulate a plan and then a plan of attack. Like I could figure out how I was going to live with it. And so that's kind of how I felt about the autism diagnosis, and also how I felt when I didn't get this as much with my physical disability, is that no one ever really told me this is exactly what is wrong with you, because doctors don't want to believe that women are in pain. That
is a huge problem, and it's worse if you're a woman of color.
Oh man, like 1,000 times. They don't want to believe people of color in general, but they certainly don't want to believe a young woman that like her knee is deteriorating. I'm way too young for that. But of course I'm also fat, and so they want to blame it on that. I'm like, look, I was way less fat before I hurt my knee. Like this has gotta be, I was also able to like run around and stuff. Just because I was fat doesn't mean I wasn't like unhealthy. And they just,
being a person who's overweight, going to the doctor is a nerve-wracking experience.
I hate it so much because thankfully I have a primary care doctor that doesn't really bring it up. I think he knows that I'm doing my best.
Yeah, and God bless those doctors as well.
But now, every orthopedic person that I've seen makes a comment about it, and I want to punch him in the face, but I usually just end up crying instead. At least I don't get arrested when I cry in somebody's office.
There's something to that, yes.
But yeah, no one really ever said to me, this is exactly what is wrong with you, the knee. It was more of a, you're in pain, learn to deal with it. And so that's been a more frustrating aspect.
Less than encouraging.
Yeah, that is. It's been less than encouraging, and that makes the physical disability aspect of it a bit more frustrating, but I also know that I am not the only one in that boat, and that is a very common occurrence. That doctors just kind of be like, even if they believe you're in pain, they're like, well, we can't really do anything about it. Take some ibuprofen. I cannot tell you how many doctors were like, just take some ibuprofen.
No, and it's, I think what's amazing with chronic pain like that, my ex-girlfriend had chronic pain, so for a year I really got to live with like what it's like to have chronic pain in your life. And every day we would wake up and it was a question of how much are we going to be able to do today based upon her pain level.
Absolutely.
Like, we have lots of plans, we'll see if your pain level is sufficient to make that happen. And in West Virginia, because of the opioid crisis, there's no pain management in the state.
Mm-hmm.
You have to drive out of state somewhere else. Now, that's not a far drive in West Virginia, but it's, if you can't drive or have other mobility issues, you're really screwed.
Yeah.
I know, and I mean for us in where we lived, Maryland, you could see Maryland from my house, so it wasn't a huge problem, and she had a car and all that sort of thing. And she didn't necessarily want to do pain management that way, and was figuring things out the other way. But I was amazed at how little the medical establishment issues and problems, and the runaround. The medical field they'll make you lose your mind trying to get them to do their job.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I mean, there were so many nights, she'd come back from the doctor, in a terrible state because the medical establishment, was being stupid again, as we used to call it, sort of thing. And it was something that I have chronic asthma and other things like that. And I'm also an overweight person, so going to the doctor can be a horrible experience. And I recently wrote about that in a post called "Hi, my name is Cameron and I'm fat," and all that sort of thing. But I had no idea when you have chronic pain, it's almost like the medical establishment turns against you.
Yes.
And it's almost like they almost like make it your fault. Like somehow you did this to yourself and sort of thing.
Yep.
Even though that's literally almost never the case. Yeah, it's a very odd sort of thing. So, I guess there's a lot of times in these situations where people can get very easily depressed. How do you stay so damn cheerful and lovely?
Well, a lot of it is when I'm not feeling cheerful and lovely is that I channel it into, my various crafts and art. And so that's one way to kind of keep my own equilibrium is, I make stuff. I write letters to my friends, and I embroider, or I sit down and I just sew something. It doesn't even matter what it is. I sew a couple pieces of a quilt or whatever. And usually, like, making an effort to do something like that helps. And it helps to just get my mind off things. It helps to expel some of that energy. And I've also been in therapy for like a really, really long time. And so I've got kind of a good back catalog of coping mechanisms that I can pull from. But that's a big, big thing with me is finding a coping mechanism that's going to make me feel a little bit better, and that's going to let me feel more centered and in control of my own emotional state.
No, that makes total sense. Speaking of art, I definitely want to dive into that in a minute, and I'm gonna wrap up this kind of line of questioning with this whole thing. I don't know if this is true for you. I think it's true for me. I've always kind of been jumping back to the autism thing, so I don't submarine you. I sometimes do that to people, even when I'm supposed to be conducting a professional interview. It's a real problem. I think it's helpful to have a name of something, and that way you're just not that weird person. Because I've always been that really weird guy.
Yeah.
The people tend to not like. There are some people that think I'm really great and interesting. They are a small minority.
Yes.
Many of them listen to this podcast. They're a small minority. Most everyone else is just kind of like, okay, that's cool, and then they just kind of run off quickly somewhere else. Kind of get away from it as fast
people
as possible.
Who weren't like in my close friend circle in high school and junior high and all of school, they treated me the same way they treated the special ed kids.
Yeah. That's sad.
Like, in just a kind of, oh, that's Sarah, she's different. And just kind of had this oh, look at her sort of way. So I totally understand what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit nice. For me, it's oftentimes come off as, please go away or please stop existing as fast as possible. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, that too.
Yeah, it's just been a weird thing. And I feel like now, if I give it a name and it's a thing, I'm no longer just that weird dude who can't ever get it together. It's like, no, no, really, there is a method to the madness. Like,
Yeah.
like an old English car, my wiring was installed wrong.
Yeah.
And yeah. Do you find that it, like, that sort of thing affects, like, all these years later, now that you've had it and have worked with it and all this sort of thing, how does it affect your day-to-day life now? Asking for a friend, that friend is me.
Yes. So how does my like autism diagnosis affect me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because for me personally, I'm seeing, like, my life is going to end in February.
Yeah. I didn't really see it like that. I saw it as, okay, this is what it is. I can now work from here. And so it was kind of like I was missing the correct set of tools. Like I didn't have the right size wrenches. And now that I know exactly what it is I need, I was able to get the right toolbox.
You had standard wrenches, but you were metric. It was a whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so it turns out I needed those like weird IKEA wrenches, and it was a whole thing.
Yes, yeah.
But that's kind of how I look at it, is that I had to get a new toolbox of figuring out life. Now it's a struggle because again, the world is not designed for the autistic. The world is so very much designed for the neurotypical, and people don't realize it. They don't realize how much the world just caters to them. And of course, more specifically, like white neurotypical people, but neurotypical people in general, like the world very much just it lays at their feet easily. And so it's very frustrating. I live with my mother, because I'm way too poor to live on my own. And she is very neurotypical, and it's so frustrating because she tries to be like, helpful. But then as soon as it's no longer convenient for me to be autistic with her, I'm being annoying, or I'm doing it on purpose, or I need to stop that, or whatever. Like, as soon as it makes her the slightest bit uncomfortable, or it gets in the way of her plans, as soon as it becomes inconvenient, it's a different matter entirely.
Yeah, that's yeah. I think you just described my childhood,
more or less,
in like a sentence. Yeah. That's kind of with the world. I didn't realize how many, until I started getting into all this reading, I didn't realize how many situations I was avoiding, or just didn't go to, or didn't care for, because of, like, the way I think that my brain works. For example, my dad was a huge hockey fan when I was a kid, and so he would take me to hockey games. Hockey's a low-scoring game, so when someone gets a goal, 20,000 people cheer.
Yeah.
And when I was 7 years old, that physically hurt.
Yes.
Like, and for me, it's so bad, I sometimes can't watch it on television. Like, it's a weird sort of thing. And so, as I grew up, as years went by, I just didn't go to football games in college. I just didn't go to those places and do those things because it didn't bring me any joy and all that type of thing. And as I've done this research, it's kind of like, yeah, that's because, that's super overwhelming, and it's a sensory nightmare for someone with sensory issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to learn, like, what my own sensory issues are, because I don't really have a problem with loudness that's like football games, or loudness that's like a rock concert, because something about it being a more uniform loud.
Yeah.
Like when it's music and I know what's coming and I know what's happening, does not bother me. I will be front row as much as I physically can. I've been to one concert since I became physically disabled, and they had a whole like section cordoned off for like disability seating, and I got to be right up front, and it was an awesome experience. It was like perfect, exactly how it should be. Like everything about the night was accessible and it was great. But interestingly enough, it was a concert at Graceland, and everything that they had was set up was fully accessible. It was very cool. But
Oh, that's very cool.
yeah, but something about like concerts and stuff, super loud, I can totally handle it. But like, if I go to a movie, there are certain points where like movies and movie theaters are just too loud. I don't know if it's because I don't know what's coming up or what, but sometimes it's too loud.
Yeah, I can do like a busy bar, which are not existing these
Yeah.
days, but a busy bar that's sort of crowd talking. That's okay. I mean, I used to work in nightlife. Nightclubs were okay. Like EDM shows, I went and saw Above and Beyond at Red Rocks, and that was totally fine, and that was all cool. I do find if it's like a 12-hour like EDM day, by like hour 10 I'm pretty exhausted.
Yeah.
I think because just having to deal with it for that long, the system gets tired and all this sort of thing. But like that sort of thing I can do, but like any time where it's like people are going to cheer at a particular moment all at the same time, and there's all that energy and noise that's focused, my poor system is just kind of like, no, thank you.
No thanks.
We cannot handle that at once.
No thanks.
Like that's too much focused input all at once.
I totally get that.
Yeah, I get the whole like, yeah, I've been to some concerts here and there. It's been all right, but yeah, but it's just kind of a weird thing because it's so obvious to me now. But I'm still struggling with the fact that it's kind of like, it's like, well, you're broken forever. Why are you doing anything that you do? Like, why, I'm a writer. I write books. I write about the human experience. I write about, trauma and how it's lived and all this type of thing. And it almost seems like I'm almost not fit for purpose for what I do. Who wants to read the words of someone they can't relate to?
Yeah, well, that's what we've been doing all of our lives.
Yeah, well, yes. True. Very true.
Like it can be done. I think that's one of the reasons art exists, is to get other experiences that you don't always see. You don't see through your own eyes. You get to see through somebody else's.
No, absolutely. And that's a good bridge because I want to talk about poetry.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So let's have a chat about that. In terms of poetry and things like that, what inspires you? What gets you to put pen to paper?
Really, it's like anytime I have a moment in life that I'm looking through a microscope at a moment, that tends to be when I get inspired. Like when I really am focused in on the minutia of something that's happening, that's and can compare it to something else. That's when I really get inspired.
No, that makes little sense. I haven't coughed all morning. I record a podcast.
Of course.
Yeah, it's been all week. So that the listeners should bear in mind, Sarah's poetry is absolutely haunting. Her command of the word visual is truly spectacular. And so when you're writing about things of your life, or these kind of little pinpoints in time, and I say this as someone who does not write poetry, I write books. How do you start? Give us an insight to how the sausage is made. How does a Wofford poem come to life?
Let's see. A Wofford poem, it starts with usually like a turn of phrase. Generally the first line of the poem is what comes to me first, and I build from there. And whether sometimes it's a metaphor will come to me, or a certain piece of imagery, and then it builds very spontaneously from there. Although I will say I don't always write poems in one sitting. Like sometimes I'll write the first 4 or 5 lines of a poem and then come back to it 6 months later and finish it. Now there are some poems that I write, it just all comes to me at once and I have to jot it down immediately and then boom, it's done. And those are no better or no worse than the ones that take a long time. Because sometimes I really only get like half of an idea. And there are some ideas that I've been writing them into different iterations of poems over time, and eventually I'll settle on the poem that I've been trying to write for a long time.
Yeah.
Would you like me to read one?
If you have something handy, that would be delightful.
I do. I'll read a short one. And this is
Please do.
This is very. It's a good exemplar of, like, I started with a metaphor and it just kind of grew from there. It's called Hail. Sometimes grief comes over me like a hailstorm. Like when we were driving back from Papa's funeral with lightning striking in the distance, a strobe light backdrop to the burning fields of summer, and we had to pull over and park under a tree while pea-sized pellets of ice dropped around us, cold and loud and scary. The ache I have, where I miss you, comes back like that, like hail on a summer day, and I don't know if I need to take cover for a minute until it passes or get ready for the storm about to come.
Talk about poetry that has absolutely nothing to do with the weather.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, it's kind of like, on the face you might think this is a weather report, but no.
It's not.
No. That's the wonderful thing. That's the wonderful thing about that. There's a whole drama and a whole story. I could write an entire novel about what you just did in like 45 seconds. Like, that's a book. Like, there's so much to unpack there. That's
that is one of my
400 pages to do what you just did.
That is one of my favorite things about poems, is the way they take really, really big, expansive thoughts and just kind of condense them down into what is something much more manageable and something that you can just look at in one sitting. I mean, there's something to be said for poems that are, epics, that are the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, that go on for entire books.
Yes.
Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's something special about poems that like so encapsulate something large and make it like edible and make it to where it's bite-sized, and that doesn't mean that it's like, it's not saying that it's like fast food, like it's like a cheap burger or anything, but it's something that is so much, it's like a slice of filet mignon. It's like one little bite, but it's been cooked to perfection. It's gone down to its essence. There's nothing superfluous about it. That's my favorite thing about poetry, is that it cuts all the excess stuff off. Because I feel like a lot of the excess stuff is just stuff we don't need. Now, don't get me wrong, I love books. I love to read, and I love all that superfluous stuff as well. But sometimes it's just not needed, and I think that's where poetry comes in.
No, absolutely. One of the things I'm doing in my next book that is, I don't think a lot of people will pick up on it, but it's really fun. The chapter titles are actually lines of a poem that I've written, and so if you actually read them all together, it comes out as a poem. It starts out, "These trees among them I will live all the days of my life in sorrow."
Oh.
Because it's set in eastern Colorado, and it's about 3 generations of women whose individual decisions affect the others.
Yeah.
And how sometimes family healing is not a thing that happens.
Yeah. It's very true.
Because people have made certain decisions, and that just can't be undone. Oftentimes. And this is a book that does not have a happy ending.
Yeah.
intentionally. I
Mhm.
wrote the ending first. I write backwards, intentionally, because to kind of go with the point of not everybody gets that happy moment where people fix their mental health issues
Mhm.
and solve their problems and be the people you want them to be. They just are who they are, and sometimes that's not what you need.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so it's, and that's the magic of poetry, is because
My dog is very excited.
yes, I can tell. That's the magic of poetry, because I'm 80,000 words in,
Uh-huh.
and I don't think, to some degree, it's not as succinct as what you did there with the hail. It's
Mhm.
just so good and so perfect. Any favorite poets?
Right now I'm really into Maggie Smith. She's an American poet. She wrote Good Bones, this poem that kind of went viral a couple of years ago.
Oh, yes, I remember it, yeah.
I'm really into her. Gosh, I read a little bit of everything. There's a Polish poet called Wisława Szymborska that I'm a really big fan of. She passed away a few years ago, but all her stuff is very, very good. So those are probably my two favorites, at least right now. If you'd ask me a different day, I might say I have a different answer, but
No, that's fair enough. Well, that is just, we're talking today, so we get what today's favorites are. Yeah, I was did there's a lot of people who have been kind of dunking on Sylvia Plath lately.
they can bite me, okay?
Well, I was going to ask you how you felt about that.
I love Sylvia Plath, and all of her haters can bite me, okay? My cat, who is sitting above my shoulder right now, is named Sylvia, okay? I
Yes.
love the bell jar. That woman was so tortured and so needed a bunch of therapy that she did not get,
Yes. Amen.
and she had a terrible husband, and
Yes.
just like, I feel like if they really made a movie, if they tried to make a movie now about Sylvia Plath, but make it modern, she'd come off as this ridiculous manic pixie dream girl because she was so weird and everything. When in reality, she was just very mentally ill.
Yeah.
And so I love Sylvia Plath. I love her poetry. I love the bell jar. I've read bits and pieces of her journals. But yeah, she was a very haunted woman, I think. And but again, because she was a young,
she called her father a Nazi. So.
What?
She called her father a Nazi.
I mean, who hasn't? She was a young woman, and we're supposed to hate young women. You know what I mean? We're supposed to and things that young women like. We're not supposed to like things that young women like. It's the reason we're not supposed to take Taylor Swift seriously, because young women like her, and she writes for young women, and things that teenage girls like are always silly and stupid, and we never take them seriously. So it's possible I have a chip on my shoulder about Sylvia Plath and a lot of things surrounding her.
I was raised, as you know, I was raised evangelical, very sheltered. I did not pick up Sylvia Plath until college. I didn't read anything written after 1880 until college. It wasn't allowed. Yeah, and even musically, I wasn't really exposed to pop music until about 2005.
I was raised Southern Baptist, but I had a library card. My parents didn't keep tabs on what I was reading. So.
Oh no, my mother followed me into the library. I used to hide. Here's how gay I was at 15. I used to hide Men's Health in the New York Times.
That's hilarious.
So I could look at hot dudes in the ads while pretending to read the New York Times or the Denver Post or whatever happened. That was how gay I was.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
No, I always went to the library with my dad, and we would ride our bikes to the library because we lived really close to it. And yeah, he didn't care what I checked out. He was a huge reader. He was a huge reader. And he He had a kidney disease. He got sick when I was about 10 or so, 10 or 11. And so eventually he was fully disabled. He was in renal failure, and he was home all the time, and he would go through a book or two a day. And we had friends that would send him just like boxes of books, and he would take a month and read them all. Like, it was insane. But he was a huge reader, and so he always encouraged me to get just whatever I wanted.
No, that's magical. I did not get the bell jar till college, and my friend Jenna, who's a virulent feminist, and she would not mind me saying that, she like put Sylvia Plath in my hands and was like, read and memorize, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that was my first exposure, and I was just kind of like, oh my goodness, this is kind of very sad and very torturous. And she's like, you have no idea.
Yeah.
Like, it was a very odd sort of thing. But I mean, yeah, it kind of rocked my world, because I was not allowed to read anything modern until I was well into college. And then after that, then fast forward a year and a half, and I'm reading erotic Nancy Friday stuff at the banned books week in the public library.
Yeah.
So I caught up quickly. I got up to speed real fast.
Yeah. I understand.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, it was a very odd sort of thing.
I think sometimes my mother won't admit it out loud, but she thinks very privately to herself that she regrets ever letting me like just read whatever I wanted. Because we don't agree on anything, like especially like politically or religiously. I am an Episcopalian. It's a very liberal denomination, and we, when I first became Episcopalian, one of my first priests was this tall lesbian lady who was just fantastic, and then like the next priest we had a nose ring. Like, it was a whole thing. I've been in a wedding that had at least one. No, hold on. Okay, I have lost track of how many trans people were in this wedding. And so, it's a very liberal denomination, and it's, whatever. And she hates it. She hates it. She's a Southern Baptist, and she just hates it. And so we don't agree on anything politically and whatnot. And I think sometimes she rues the day she was like, oh, my daughter should think for herself. And then she like actually taught me to think for myself, and now she regrets it.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. I have a similar relationship with my parents. They live in Colorado and are very Republican, and I live in one of the bluest states in the country, in one of the bluest congressional districts in the country, represented by a Justice Democrat, Pramila Jayapal, who is my congressperson. Mm-hmm. And so it's literally like Central Midwest versus Coastal Elite.
Yeah.
In my family.
It feels like it's that in my family, even though like I'm not a coastal elite. I'm like, unless the coast is the coast of the Mississippi River.
Yes. I mean, I have this advantage of, I had education in Colorado. I had education back east in Vermont.
Yeah.
Like, I am literally a coastal elite. Yeah. It's, sort of a thing. So we have like the reality of that tension. And I'm the one who's like, I'm a writer, and I'm into literature and art and progress and all this sort of thing. And I was, friends with the woman who created the San Jose Museum of Modern Art, and I worked for her for 10 years and all this sort of thing. And my mother was just, I think she feels similarly that letting me darken the door of a public college was just the worst thing ever, because it exposed me to the insanity of the world.
Yeah. Oh, I think she regrets ever getting me a library card. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of odd how people, like, sometimes parents, whatever have you, think that, they do this, and they think their kids are going to grow up to think and act just like them.
Yeah.
And I get that impetus. I think that's very biological. I think it's very human.
Hey, my brother does.
Yeah.
My brother is
that's 1 out of 2.
Carbon copy. And buddy.
That's 1 out of 2.
Yeah.
It wasn't a total loss.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very human, biological thing to just want to kind of create more of yourself. But then I think the difficulty with children is not realizing they're going to have their own thoughts. They're going to have their own ideas, hopefully. And they may very well be different than you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of parents don't realize that their kids are going to be people one day.
Yes.
That they just see them as these little beings that are parts of them. And
Yes.
but from a kid's perspective, you're your own person immediately.
Right.
You know, I just remember being a kid and feeling very much that I was me, and I was only me. I didn't necessarily define myself as like being so and so's daughter, you know. And so I think a lot of people who become parents aren't ready for that, which is a shame.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very odd dynamic. It's one of the reasons you're gonna find this very sad. It's one of the reasons I do not want to have children.
Same.
Because my greatest fear is that they will grow up to become people that I don't like.
Yep.
And that's partly because of the relationship my mother and I have, because she does not like me.
Yeah.
And I've said, and when I say that, she doesn't disagree with me. If we were not related, we would not be friends.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. We're just very, very different people.
I totally understand.
Yeah, and I can't do that. I can't do that sort of thing. And I think the other difficulty is, because I know myself, is that, if I don't want to subject children to the same treatment I got for being the child that was not liked.
Yeah.
And I can't guarantee that won't happen. So
yeah.
Best just not to procreate. There's almost 7 billion people on the planet.
Yeah, we got too many of them as it is. It's fine.
Yes. We're hitting peak population at 2040, not a moment too soon.
Yep.
And then population decline, thank goodness. So, all right, Sarah, well, we're almost at about time. This conversation has been delightful. It's been so good getting to know you.
Oh, well, thank you. Likewise.
Yes, and I don't know if you have anything to plug. We usually do plugs at this time, at about the 45-minute mark. But if you have anywhere people can find you online, now is the time to shout it out.
I am on Twitter at Sarah Wofford 42, and then I'm on Instagram at AdventureSarah42, because I'm a big Douglas Adams fan, and 42 is the answer to life, universe, and everything.
Yes.
So
it's also the same number of decks on the Starship Enterprise.
Yes, exactly.
I'm a big Star Trek guy.
Heck yeah.
Yeah.
That's rad. Yeah, that's all I've got. I will eventually have a podcast coming out, but we're not quite to the plugging it stage yet, but it's in the works.
All right. Well, we'll look for that at that time. So make sure to follow her on Twitter, so when the podcast comes out, you'll be there. Thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
You are super welcome. Thank you for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.